while also analyzing its impact on American history, people, and thought. TeachingAmericanHistory.org is a project of the Ashbrook Center, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization based at Ashland University. We provide a variety of programs and resources for teachers of American history, government, and civics, all based on primary documents. In the next week, you will receive an email with a link to request a certificate of participation, as well as a link to the archived video and audio from tonight's program. To help us begin to think about the topics of this year's webinars, we are drawing speeches, letters, and writings from the Ashbrook Center's voluminous document database available at TAH.org. And you can participate as well in this discussion by typing your questions into the chat window at the bottom of your screen at any time. I will occasionally be going to that and reading questions aloud. The subject of today's program is James Monroe's 7th annual message to Congress from 1823, at least those parts that are better known to us today as the Monroe Doctrine. To help discuss it, our Dr. Eric Pullen, Associate Professor of History at Carthage College, and Dr. Jay Sexton, Kinder Institute Chair in Constitutional Democracy and Professor of History at the University of Missouri. Eric, Jay, welcome. Glad you can be with us tonight.
Great to be here.
All right. Well, let me just start off with a very general question. Monroe Doctrine. Most people have heard of it. Probably most people don't know what it means. Why is it so important to understanding American history?
Jay, I want to give this. I want to give you the first shot here because you've recently published on the Monroe Doctrine.
Well, then let me emerge. Have I emerged for the everybody in video form? Okay. So why is it so important? Why is the Monroe Doctrine so important? I think that it's important for two reasons. The first one is that it responded to an acute crisis, or at least what the contemporaries, what the statesmen and the broader public in 1823 considered to be a very acute international crisis. So it had a legacy for that reason. And that leads me to the second reason why I think it's a long-lasting document, why it's something we're still talking about it almost 200 years later, and that is because subsequent generations of Americans have looked to the Monroe Doctrine for inspiration, for guidance, and indeed to look to it for direction in how they related to peoples, not just of the Western Hemisphere, which is, of course, what the text talked about most directly, but also international relations more generally.
Okay. Eric, what would you like to add?
Well, I'd like to echo exactly what Professor Sexton just offered, is that the Monroe Doctrine addressed an important problem in its time, and echo also that it has been used by subsequent practitioners of foreign policy going into the 20th century. In fact, even as recently as the Obama administration, whether to negate or affirm it. But the thing I think I would add, in addition to what Professor Sexton said, is that what is interesting and noteworthy about the Monroe Doctrine is that whether it was John Quincy Adams or President Monroe or the subsequent practitioners of American foreign policy who invoked the Monroe Doctrine, did so by referring to American principles. And whether they were sincere or disingenuous about how they use the Monroe Doctrine, one of the things that I think that stands as a continuing theme throughout American history as relates to the Monroe Doctrine is the idea that it's quintessentially American.
Okay. Well, Jay mentioned the immense crisis, or the immense perceived crisis that this was written in response to. Can you say a little bit more about the nature of that crisis?
Absolutely. I mean, the crisis in the 1820s was the climax of a much longer international process in which European old world colonial structures and institutions were eroding, were collapsing across the ocean in the Western Hemisphere. So the American version, which we're most familiar with, is of course the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence in 1776. The Monroe Doctrine dealt with the United States' response to the collapse of the Spanish Empire. The Spanish Empire, which had collapsed really at the beginning of the 19th century, process of very complex, very convoluted revolutions, wars of independence, which had reached their apogee or their climax in 1823, and most of the former Spanish colonies had become independent republics. Now, whether or not they would stay independent, whether or not their form of government would remain republican, or it might revert to monarchies or aristocracies, other types of political organization, was the question that was facing the Monroe administration in 1823. And the final little spin on the crisis was, of course, the threat, the persistent threat that the reactionary powers of the old world would intervene, would cross the Atlantic to crush the rebellions and to reimpose some form of colonial rule on these new Spanish American states. So that was the crisis. I said one more thing. Let me add one more thing. Finally, the other bit of the crisis, or the context, the backstory to this was, of course, British policy. Great Britain, now the world's preeminent power in 1823 after the defeat of Napoleonic France in 1815. Britain, which wanted trading opportunities in Spanish America, but was not quite sure if it wanted the types of political constitutions, the forms of government that the United States wanted, that we were just hearing about American forms of politics. So the British policy was a real X factor for the United States and a precipitant of the Monroe Doctrine itself, which was written in response to a what initially at least was a British offer of joint Anglo-American action to deter the reactionary powers of continental Europe from intervening across the Atlantic.
Fascinating. Eric.
Yeah, what I'm about to add is really a footnote to what Professor Sexton said. I think he's dead on. I think he identifies the Latin American revolutions and Britain's ambivalence about how to deal with these revolutions and what it should do in the Western Hemisphere. But I'd also like to add that there are events occurring in Greece and also in the western part of North America that are motivating the Monroe administration to assert American jealousy in the hemisphere. And these two tensions work against each other. So let me draw this out a little bit. In Greece in 1820-21, you have the Greeks engaging in a revolution against the Ottoman Turks, and many progressives, many liberals, many Democrats, little d Democrats, little r Republicans, people who believe in national self-assertion, are demanding that the United States and other similarly minded democratic countries support the Greek Revolution against the Turks. In addition, what's happening on the west coast of the North American continent is that the Russians, the Imperial Russians, are moving, or they're laying claims to areas such as Alaska and claiming territory as south as the 55th parallel. And John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State, and President James Monroe are both of a mind to say, on the one hand, the Russians should not be doing what they're doing, and on the other hand, they're saying, well, maybe we shouldn't get involved in a Greek revolution. And so the Monroe Doctrine is a is a sort of, and I don't want to make too much of this, but I am going to say it anyway, a uniquely American response to all of these international events. But I will emphasize that Professor Sexton's emphasis on Latin American revolutions is probably the most important.
Okay, we have our first question from a participant. Larry Fata asks, we know that the document was largely the work of John Quincy Adams. Out of curiosity, how much did President Monroe contribute to this text? Do we know?
That's a great question. I mean, the authorship of any of these sorts of documents, and of course the place to begin to answer that question is say this is what we now call the State of the Union address. Back in the 19th century, it was called the Annual Message. The Annual Message was quite different than the State of the Union address today, in the sense that it was not verbally delivered by a president, but was rather delivered in paper form to Congress. And it was always, I shouldn't say always, but almost always jointly authored. So the president would delegate to his cabinet officials the initial drafts for the sections on the post office, on foreign affairs, on the state of the finances, to the Secretary of Treasury, and so forth. So the first thing I think to say in response to that question is it's very typical of this type of document for it to be the product of multiple authors. That's the first point. Second point is that John Quincy Adams was the principal author of the early drafts on the section on foreign affairs. So what becomes known as the Monroe Doctrine can be traced to John Quincy Adams quite clearly. We also know from his diary, which, as a side note, is one of the best sources of 19th century political history, John Quincy Adams's diary, which goes all the way up until the 1840s, meticulously kept, and particularly in this period of October and November of 1823, when the administration is drafting its response to the international crisis, we know from his diary that the text of this actual State of the Union annual message addressed was discussed at length by the full cabinet, and it had input not just of Secretary of State Adams, but also the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of War John C. Calhoun, James Monroe, the Attorney General William Wirt had some very important input in it as well. So that is a long-winded way of saying there's multiple authors, there's a lot of chefs in that kitchen, but Adams is clearly the defining figure in it. And actually one of the key paragraphs from the message, the so-called non-colonization clause, Adams had earlier drafted in response, in a routine sort of diplomatic response to the Russians, which we were hearing about earlier on the Pacific Northwest. So Adams is the predominant author, but everybody has a say in it. It is a collective document. And if we want to see this as a quintessentially American document, I think that would help make that case, actually, that it's not the product of a single figure, but of the collective statesmen operating in 1823.
Eric?
Oh, I can't add a thing to that. That I agree completely.
Okay. Mentioning it as a quintessentially American statement, it leads me to wonder whether the importance of this document lies in what it tells us about the American mind of the early 19th century, as opposed to what it tells us about foreign affairs. I guess this is another way of asking, does this matter? I mean, if Spain had been able to reconquer its Latin American colonies, was there a thing that the United States could have done to stop it? And so did this even enter into the calculations of the European powers?
Yeah, I'll jump in if I may. My sense is that no, this is a document of opportunity. Spain could not reassert itself. Professor Sexton might disagree with me, but no, I think that's exactly why the United States issues such a document, is precisely because of Spanish impotence. At the same time, I think that the United States appreciates, and most particularly and specifically, John Quincy Adams appreciates that no one's getting across the Atlantic without the permission or the acquiescence of the British Royal Navy. And so, given those ideas, this is or given those, not ideas, but given those facts or those appreciations of foreign policy, I think that Adams sees this as a remarkable opportunity to assert American power at no cost. And the reason why I call it a quintessentially American document is not because I'm an unalloyed cheerleader of American foreign policy, but rather it's a document that has a protean character. It seems to lose its meaning and force after the Monroe administration. And initially, it's a document that says, "Hey, no new powers can assert themselves in the Western Hemisphere." And it later, and we can talk about this in more detail with subsequent questions, but it becomes a document that justifies the American exertion of its foreign policy might. So I hope I'm answering your question, but there are other perspectives on this as well.
Okay, Jay, anything to add to that?
I mean, what I would say first is that the real threat in 1823 wasn't that the Spanish were going to cross the Atlantic. It was that the French and a consortium of monarchical powers led by the French would. That's the first point. The second point, your question was, could the United States really do anything to stop this, or was this document just a paper tiger? And that is one of the most important questions asked during those cabinet deliberations when they're framing this, the draft text of the annual message, and it's asked by the Attorney General, William Wirt, and he says, what are we going to do if we announce our opposition to this and the powers send their forces over anyways? And Adams, in his diary, says, "Man, that was a great question." Then he also says, or he doesn't say directly, but reading between the lines, he reveals that question was never answered. The administration never came up with an answer to that question. One more point. In many ways, this whole thing was a phony crisis because the British initially came to the United States and asked for joint action to deter France and her allies from intervening. That message is given to the American minister in London. It's discussed with the Foreign Secretary, the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Canning. Then it has to be shipped all the way over to Washington. That takes about 6 weeks. It's discussed for several weeks. There's no clear answer given to it immediately. And as time elapsed, or in this interregnum, the British Foreign Secretary had met with the French ambassador, and they had struck an agreement that France would not intervene. So, in essence, the Monroe Doctrine was announced, enunciated, after the crisis had already been solved by the British Foreign Secretary. So the whole thing. So your initial question was, is this episode really revealing something about how America thinks of itself and thinks of the world rather than a definitive weighing in on an international crisis? Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. The crisis really never existed, and to the extent to which it did, it had already been resolved before December 2nd, 1823, the date of the Monroe Doctrine.
Well, this helps to answer another question that a participant has raised. I'm wondering why the British acquiesced and even helped support the Monroe Doctrine, since the U.S. didn't have the power to back the words at that time, rather than trying to expand its empire into South America.
Well, it's a great question. If I can take the first stab at it, I mean, I think the answer to it is that British conceptions of empire and national interests are evolving in this period, and the British Empire is moving away from the kind of model of colonization, of sending immigrants to North America to settle and then to be ruled over. It's moving away from that, at least in the Western Hemisphere, I should say. It's moving away from that to more of a hybrid, informal mechanism of empire, which prioritized the creation of new markets, of foreign trading systems, investment patterns, essentially an effort to reap the rewards of empire while reducing the costs, to get rid of those costly overheads of empire, of having to directly rule over populations that might rebel against you, and to attempt to reap the benefits through commerce, trade, and investment. Now, just to clarify, that is the British policy as it's emerging piecemeal in Latin America. That is not the British policy in, say, India at this same time, or even in bits of the Caribbean, where there's still the legacy of a more traditional form of colonial rule. But the answer is that the British are starting to change, and of course that will be the hallmark of the apogee of the British Empire in the Victorian era. Really, not a system of imposed rule so much as an economic order or regime, which Britain exploits very deftly to its own advantage and benefit.
Okay, Eric, you care to add to that?
I don't know if I'm answering your question is more about Britain than it is the United States. Am I right?
Well, it's why was Britain willing to go along with this policy?
Yeah, I don't think I could add much to that. I think that I might take it in a slightly different direction by saying, why is it that the United States wouldn't just go along with Britain? And I think Professor Sexton will know the quotation better than I will, but John Quincy Adams says something along the lines of, we don't want to be a cockboat in the wake of a British frigate. Is it a rough paraphrase?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and the idea is that if the United States goes along with Britain and appears to sanction Britain's proposal after the fact, then John Quincy Adams, I think, has successfully reasoned then that the United States has reduced itself to the junior partner of Great Britain. What's more is we're only talking about, 5 or 6 years after the War of 1812 has ended, and the last thing Americans want to do is be perceived as British subordinates. So John Quincy Adams, I think, successfully reasons that it's in Britain's interest to patrol the seas and keep. I'll agree with Professor Sexton on the French, but also the Holy Alliance, and especially the Russians coming at North America from the other way, from the Pacific, rather than from the Atlantic, as the French would do. But basically, the United States want to appear as if they are in control of events, or it is in control of events, rather than following Britain's lead. None of what I just said is inconsistent at all with what I think Jay said, but I think it bears stating that, at least in my opinion, what one of John Quincy Adams, and forgive me if I keep stressing the Z, it's just what was drilled into me when I was an undergraduate by one of my professors, is basically the idea that the United States wants to appear as if it is in the frigate and not in the cockboat or in the dinghy behind the larger ship.
A certain amount of this, I would think, would have something to do with Adams' own origins. I mean, as one of our participants pointed out, he had extensive diplomatic experience of his own, but just as importantly, he is son of one of the most prominent Federalists in a Democratic administration. And sure, this is supposed to be the era of good feelings where parties don't matter, but I would think that Adams is eager to avoid any suggestion from others in the administration that he's pro-British. Would that be, is that a fair estimate?
Oh yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, that's That is always the way to end a political career in the 19th century. Is appearing to be pro British. Though interestingly, Calhoun and Monroe, in those cabinet discussions, they're prepared to sign up to the British deal. When the British first approach for joint action, they're prepared to sign up to the British deal, even with the poison pill that comes with that British deal, and that is the condition of that alliance with Britain to stop the Holy Allies from intervening in the New World. The condition was that both of the signatories, both Britain and the United States, would renounce any intention to formally annex or acquire new territories of the former Spanish Empire. So I think Adams is the quintessential expansionist of this period. He's got his eyes on Texas, then part of the new state of Mexico. He's got his eyes on Cuba. He thinks both will be valuable additions to the Union. He says it very clearly. He says that's too high of a price to pay to sign up for the British proposal, when Britain, he predicts, will oppose a French intervention anyway. So why would we agree to these terms? It's a bad deal, right? Now, I think the thing that needs more explaining, actually, is the thinking of Calhoun and Monroe in the cabinet. Why are they prepared to sign up to this deal, which would foreclose the possibility of annexing Texas and Cuba in the future? And this is something in which really the historical record is not helpful, or at least is not as helpful as we would wish it to be. Adams does not record their mindset quite as clearly as he records his own, which is the advantage of being someone who drafts the minutes of a meeting or enters the record in a diary. I mean, the sense that I have is that Monroe and Calhoun have a heightened sense of risk and of security risk if there is to be a European intervention in the Western Hemisphere. I think that this is no doubt linked in some way to the perceived vulnerabilities of the southern states because of slavery. Slavery is the big dog that doesn't bark in this whole episode. It's not in Adams's diary. It's not in the Monroe Doctrine itself, but slavery is a crucial issue. It had just been behind the Great Missouri Crisis, which had only recently been resolved. There were emerging factions for and against, building up to the great Jacksonian debates over slavery in the coming decades. So it's in the air, and I think it conditions the security mindset, the perception of threat and risk of the different Americans in that cabinet. So Adams, as a Northerner, I think doesn't think that there's as much risk in dealing or taking a tough stand with the British and the Europeans as do Calhoun and Monroe, with the experience, of course, of the Revolution and the War of 1812 fresh in mind, in which international conflict has a way of destabilizing slavery. Therefore, you must prevent international conflict at all costs. Now, again, that's my gloss on it because it's not clear in the record. It's one of the more frustrating things there, but it must have been on their minds in some way. And this is where the job of the historian is really fun. It's not to make things up, but it's to make reasoned inferences based on evidence and contextual evidence and data and circumstances, and to try to understand and recreate the very complex, multidimensional mindsets of these statesmen.
Okay. Eric.
John, yeah, I really want to emphasize the point about international conflict destabilizing the institution of slavery. And I don't want to give away too much of the game here, but both John Quincy Adams and John C. Calhoun will switch in a sense as we get closer to the Mexican-American War. But one of the things that I think is really remarkable about international conflict, especially in the Western Hemisphere, as it relates to the United States, is that the more the United States expands, the more the United States gets involved in foreign countries, the more the institution of slavery is in fact threatened. The acquisition of the Mexican cession, talk of I mean, Cuba has been a source of desire on the part of the American or the United States since since at least the Adams administration. And the idea that Cuba, with its large African population, should become part of the United States is something that I think caused a great deal of controversy in the American Republic. And the controversy stemmed from not knowing what to do with this large African population. Should we enslave them? Should we treat them like we treat the people of Haiti? And Haiti itself is another great example of the destabilization of the institution of slavery, because the revolution in slavery, the revolution in Haiti, led by Toussaint Louverture and slaves, effectively led Americans of both North and South to say, we're not going to recognize this country, or if not officially recognize this country, we're not going to deal on equal terms with people of African descent who are sovereign over themselves. And these cause problems for, and this I think takes, I hope I'm not being too confusing here, but it takes me back to the idea of the Monroe Doctrine being a quintessentially American document, because there are contradictions written into the document, and not just the document, but the documents that support it. There's all this talk about freedom, but like Professor Sexton says, slavery is this unspoken gorilla in the room that no one's talking about, but everyone knows is important to determining the nature, not only of how the United States keeps foreign competitors out of the Western Hemisphere, but also how the United States manages its own expansion in the Western Hemisphere.
Okay. David Cedar asks a question of, to what extent is religion a motivation here? Of course, when we talk about France and especially Spain, we're talking about Catholic powers. The black legend of the Spanish is something that runs deep in the American tradition. Is at least part of the concern about Latin America being recolonized a fear of international Catholicism?
Oh yeah, I mean, I absolutely, and it's one of those things. I think that it takes a lot of historical imagination for us to recapture that the visceral hatred of Catholicism among not just the American Protestant elite, but also the British Protestant elite. So I think that's there. I think two more things about religion and the Monroe Doctrine. The first is that, in the broader context of how the United States begins to open up diplomatic relations with these new states in Spanish America, it has essentially three agendas the United States does when it recognizes the independence of these new states. The first agenda is to promote a republican form of government in Spanish America as opposed to a monarchical form of government. The second agenda is to promote some kind of commercial reciprocity or economic arrangement in which there would be reciprocal trade and investment patterns that would be encouraged by the states themselves. And then the third thing, often underappreciated, is that the John Quincy Adams, as Secretary of State, he's always banging on about religious toleration. He wants he doesn't want Protestants to be discriminated against. There's not huge numbers of Protestants. I think he's probably thinking more of enclaves of American and British merchants than anything else, but he's attempting to introduce the principle of religious toleration. So that's important there. The final point about how religion plays in or fits into all this is, of course, it's an argument that cuts both ways when it comes to the question of should the United States attempt to cultivate close relations with these new states. Many would say we have a religious duty to spread the principles of toleration, and indeed, that's really the thin end of the wedge to spread Protestantism, if you think about it. But their opponents would say, you know what, the state of Catholicism in the Spanish Empire is so corrupt, and it's degraded the Spanish Americans to such an extent that they are probably incapable of self-government. We can't trust them. They will not be able to build the institutions of civil society and government to create a functioning state because the Catholic Church has suppressed all of those tendencies over the course of centuries. So they're just simply unprepared. This is a classic kind of anti-Catholicism argument that you see throughout the 19th century, even into the 20th century, I should say. You see this oftentimes when Americans are contemplating what to do in the Philippines after 1898. So religion is absolutely there, but the takeaway is it doesn't lead inexorably into one policy direction. It can go into multiple different policy directions, and that's something that's debated about not just by the statesmen, but also in the press of the time. The journals of the time are going back and forth on this issue of Catholicism, Protestantism, and the capacity for self-government of the Spanish Americans.
Eric.
Yeah, I think that what Jay is saying is dead on target, and if I may, just like to refer us to John Quincy Adams' speech on Independence Day, and one of the things that really strikes me about the document is, I mean, what I know about John Quincy Adams is that he was the type of man. Well, let me start over. When I think of John Quincy Adams, I think of America's best pre-president and America's best ex-president and one of America's worst presidents. And I think to myself when I'm approaching it from that perspective, that John Quincy Adams is about the last guy I would want to have a beer with. I have tremendous respect, especially for when he was in the House of Representatives after his presidency, leading the fight against slavery, and his, I think his greatest moment was in opposing the gag rule. But what about his personality? His personality is such that, I mean, this is a man who would wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock, if he was feeling very lazy, and would teach himself, or he would learn scriptures for hours before, while I think while they're negotiating the end of the War of 1812, Henry Clay is just coming in from an evening of gambling and drinking, and John Quincy Adams is just getting up to learn his scripture. Why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because he's not a fun guy. But that said, I'm looking through this document and I see so much commentary about religion. And it doesn't match up with the John Quincy Adams I know, unless I use the historical imagination that Professor Sexton is talking about. And you realize that when he says negative, critical, condemnatory things about religion, he's not talking about religion as a disaggregated whole. He's talking about Catholicism in specific. And the first giveaway is in the very first paragraph here when, and I'm not sure what document people might be looking at, but it's in the first paragraph. And he says, in the theories of the crown and the mitre, man had no rights. That's a swipe at Catholicism. That's not a swipe at Protestantism, nor is it a swipe at the Protestant Christianity that John Quincy Adams thinks is the normative type of Christianity that people ought to be observing. And in fact, this document, Speech on Independence Day, is is littered with phrases along the lines of ecclesiastical usurpation, uh, religions founded in conquest and oppression. Let me see, I could go on, but I think you get the point. I think what Professor Sexton is saying is dead on target. And in answer to the participant's question about religion, I think that it is like slavery, even though he mentions it, John Quincy Adams. It's another one of those subtexts that we might be little too eager to dismiss because we want to focus on the acquisitive nature of American policy after the Monroe administration, or the self-righteousness of JQA when he's writing this. But yeah, religion is very important, and I really echo Professor Sexton's comments along those lines.
It's interesting that in this document he actually uses the term Holy Alliance, but he means something very different by it. This is on, well, yeah, I don't know what pagination it is. We all print these out differently, but it's something like the 5th page, in the middle of the page for me. At the end of this paragraph, he, well, of course, this sentence goes on, so I'm not sure where I should start, but he says, and by the communion of soul in the reperusal and hearing of this instrument, to renew the genuine Holy Alliance of its principles. So the real Holy Alliance is not Prussia and Russia and Austria and perhaps France, depending on who's in charge, but rather the Holy Alliance is the sum of the principles expressed in the Declaration of Independence. Let's go back. One of our participants points out that he uses somewhere in this there is specific praise of Luther, right, as actually offering a freedom from the bad kind of religion, which they would have regarded as Catholicism. Let's see. Well, let me ask this: what happened to the Monroe Doctrine? Obviously, Teddy Roosevelt invokes it in his famous corollary at the beginning of the 20th century, and then repeatedly you heard it mentioned in reference to the German threat and later on the communist threat, right? And it gets talked about in the case of Cuba. I certainly remember in the 1980s hearing it mentioned in reference to Nicaragua and whether Nicaragua would become a Soviet base in the Western Hemisphere. Was it invoked frequently in the 19th century? I seem to recall hearing that the Monroe Doctrine had essentially been forgotten by the time of Teddy Roosevelt, and he dusts it off and breathes new life into it. But what do the two of you have to say on that?
Well, I actually, forgive me for interrupting you, Professor Sexton, but I think that's an exaggeration. The idea that Teddy Roosevelt dusted off. I don't think it was forgotten. I mean, I think that you have Buchanan talk about the Monroe Doctrine. You've got gosh, I'm trying to remember what's his name? Van Buren talk about the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine is invoked repeatedly, but it's unable to be enforced. So if Teddy Roosevelt dusts it off, it's only because the nature of U.S. power has changed. But Americans from the 1830s into the early 20th century I won't say that they assert the Monroe Doctrine the way that Americans talk about that most important element of the Declaration of Independence: all men are created equal. But yeah, I don't think the Monroe Doctrine remains not moribund. It remains a dormant document throughout most of the 19th century. I think it's just unenforceable. Maybe Professor Sexton has a different approach.
No, I mean, Yeah, I think you can find more references to it than one might think. I would say that what's most significant about the Monroe Doctrine in the 19th century is that it is very, very rarely invoked against foreign powers, against European powers, which was the original message. And it's far more often invoked against internal domestic political opponents. So the real story of the Monroe Doctrine in the 19th century is the story of a national symbol um, becoming a political football or an instrument of partisan conflict. And this really starts, I think, with James K. Polk, the president of the 1840s, the president who's the architect of the great policies of expansion, the acquisition of California in particular, but also the Oregon Territory in the Northwest, and his campaign is also when the Texas annexation unfolds. And this is when the Monroe Doctrine becomes, for the first time, the Monroe Doctrine. Before that, it was simply called the message of the annual message of Monroe, the seventh annual message of Monroe in 1823. Polk is one of the first ones to actually call it a doctrine. And he does so on behalf of a deeply divisive policy of expansion. So it's a clear example of the appropriation of a popular symbol from a popular president. I mean, Monroe's presidency, we don't really know much about it today, but in the 1840s and 50s, he was seen as an example of this pre-partisan past. You were talking about the era of good feelings earlier, a time in which Americans weren't so divided, in which they came up with compromise solutions to the problems of the day. That gave great traction to the Monroe Doctrine, and it made it a very useful symbol to be exploited. So the story I tell in the book that I wrote about the Monroe Doctrine is actually less about foreign policy, although there's elements of it, but it's more about the domestic politics and how these nationalist symbols across party lines, how they're imagined and then reimagined, how they change, they take on new forms, and how they give legitimacy and power to those who invoke them. And in that sense, though there's not much talk about the Monroe Doctrine in the 20th century or today by comparison, there's comparable symbols and images of American foreign policy. Things like anti-communism during the Cold War. That's something that definitely crosses party lines and is a powerful symbol. Things about national security and terrorism today. Again, there's elements of foreign policy there, but there's also really important domestic political dimensions to them.
I'd like to jump in again, if I may, John. And I was taking notes, and I really, really appreciate the fact that Jay focuses on domestic politics, because really my historical interest is in foreign policy. And I was just looking through my notes and several books in preparation for this, but the Monroe Doctrine, or as Professor Sexton appropriately says, Monroe's speech is invoked at least in cabinet discussions in the 1830s when the British formally annexed the Falkland Islands. It's annexed again, or it's made reference to again during a 12-year period when Britain and France are blockading Argentina. And between 1838 and 1850, Argentina won't pay its debts, and the British will not let the Argentines, and this is just a couple of years after they've taken the Falklands away from Argentina, they're basically lording themselves over Argentina and will not let Argentina trade until its debts have been paid. Yeah. And the United States says, well, this is clearly a violation of Monroe's principles, but there's nothing we can do about it. During the Civil War, France's Emperor Napoleon III makes a bid to conquer Mexico, and actually succeeds for quite a while. But the United States, given whether it's the Confederacy, well, I shouldn't say the United States, the Union, neither the Union nor the Confederacy are in a position to prevent the French from conquering Mexico. And then, of course, you have the during the Civil War also, you have the British conquest and then formal annexation, or let me phrase it, conversion of British Honduras, which is now the country of Belize, into a colony. So even before we get to Teddy Roosevelt, American foreign policy makers are very concerned about foreign intrusion in the Western Hemisphere, but they're impotent to do anything about it. And nothing I said negates anything that.
No, but to add the coda to your points, the process of the circulation of these powerful symbols of foreign policy, that's, it's not exclusively a domestic process. My understanding of the Buenos Aires issue in the 1830s was that it was the Argentines who came to the United States and said, this is a clear violation of the Monroe Doctrine. During the Civil War, it was the Mexican liberals, the Mexican Republicans, those who opposed the French intervention. They were the ones talking about the Monroe Doctrine, using it to coax, to lure the United States out of its shell, to stand by the principles which one of its presidents had so publicly affirmed. And that's a really interesting dynamic that's going on. And actually, when you move the story into the 20th century, it has a darker side, in the sense that it's the Japanese imperialists of the 1930s who are invoking the Monroe Doctrine and saying that their efforts at expansion are only mimicking what the United States had done. So these symbols have an international as well as a domestic legacy, and a very long-lasting one.
You're making me furious. You stole my thunder. I'm so jealous. One of the points I was hoping to make tonight is that the Japanese Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere is really nothing more than a Japanese assertion of the Monroe Doctrine.
Yeah,
and it's the Japanese.
They call it that.
Yeah, look, this is our shtick. Look what we did.
Yeah.
So I really like that point a lot, especially when you start out by pointing out that it's the Venezuela, or it's the Argentinians and the Mexicans who say, please invoke the Monroe Doctrine. And then the Japanese later, like you say, take on this really dark and disturbing approach in the 1930s and 40s, when they basically say, hey, this is just the Japanese version of what America has been doing.
And then the one other thing to add, I hope I don't steal your thunder again, but
that's right.
What's interesting is the trend that up through Roosevelt, up to Franklin Roosevelt, I should say, American presidents, when they're looking for some kind of symbol of their foreign policy, they try to present it or package it as the Monroe Doctrine, or as a corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, or something that loosely is connected to the Monroe Doctrine. What happens as the presidency, the power of the executive increases in the mid-20th century, the imperial presidency of the Second World War and the Cold War era, is that presidents start developing their own doctrines. So you got the Truman Doctrine, the Eisenhower Doctrine, you go all the way up, and now it's just an expectation, right? I mean, I remember reading, when I was finishing the book, Obama was coming into office, and everybody was right, well, what's going to be the Obama Doctrine? I mean, the assumption was there had to be an Obama Doctrine. Each president has to have their own distinctive spin. Quite different from the 19th century, when you had weak executives, weak presidents. disinclined to assert their authority, in particular overseas, but assert their authority in general. And so when they did, they wanted to present it or package it as part of a tradition of presidential power going back to Monroe, a rather weak president when you think of him in the broad scale or scheme of things, those early 19th century presidents.
Eric, I'll give you the last word.
On this subject?
Sure. On anything you like related to the Monroe Doctrine, since we're almost out of time.
Okay, here's what I want to say. I wanted to, boy, there's a lot of 20th century stuff. We could have talked about this, but here's what I want to say. I think it's really interesting that as recently as 2013, John Kerry, Secretary of State John Kerry, declared an end to the Monroe Doctrine. And it depends on what news source you're reading, but Kerry's words are greeted either with great acclaim and fanfare or yawning boredom. And I think what's important about the Obama presidency is that President Obama, through Kerry, essentially said that the era of the United States either protecting Latin America, which is the basic idea of the Monroe Doctrine, Central and South America, or the idea of the United States intruding in Latin America is over. It's gone. It's done with. And I think that that's really interesting because it is a repudiation or at least a turning of the page on what I think has been the most important foreign policy document to justify American behavior in the 19th and 20th centuries.
All right. Well, I want to thank both of our participants, Eric and Jay, our panelists, rather, as well as our participants for their questions. Just a reminder about the email you will receive with a link for a certificate of participation. That will be coming the next couple of days. If you have enjoyed today's webinar, please consider taking an online graduate course through the Ashbrook Center. These are also offered as part of our Master of Arts in American History and Government program. Eric teaches in that program. Maybe we'll get Jay involved in it too at some point. You can find more information about Ashbrook's online course offerings at teachingamericanhistory.org. You can help us spread the word about these programs by sharing the archive link, which you will receive via email next week. Please send that to your colleagues and share it on social media if you are so inclined. Our next Documents in Detail webinar will be Wednesday, November 15th, when our subject will be Frederick Douglass's What to the Slave is the 4th of July. At that time, I will be joined by Dr. Emily Hess of Ashland University and Dr. Peter Myers of the University of Wisconsin at Eau Claire. The recommended readings for that webinar have been posted. So I hope to see you back here. Well, with any luck, I will be in Ashland, but on the evening of November 15th. Thanks a lot and have a great evening.